John O'Shea, thank you so much.
I appreciate you having me on, Jack.
So, you are running for Congress, the 12th District, and you announced even before Congresswoman Kay Granger decided she was going to retire. So, why are you running?
Well, I don't like the direction this country's headed, like most Americans that I speak to on a day-to-day basis. And the way that I view it right now is that you're either part of the solution or you're part of the problem. And I had the kind of the ability to enter the race and felt called to do so. So here I am.
And why should Republicans vote for you in the May 28th primary runoff as opposed to your opponent?
So, especially when there was a more crowded field, because as you mentioned, I announced when I was running against Congresswoman Granger, who chairwoman of appropriations, 14-term incumbent, that was a tall task. But now the field of 5 has been narrowed down to 2, and I think that now that it's a binary choice, there's a lot of dichotomy between the two candidates. The gentleman who is my opponent right now in the primary has been in the state house for the last 10 years and has been part of the House leadership. I would say is viewed more as part of the Republican establishment, whereas I tend to fall under more of the America First kind of Ken Paxton wing of the Republican Party. And I think there is a bit of a civil war in the Texas Republican Party right now, and I think having voters have a binary choice as to whether or not they would rather return back to the more establishment kind of George Bush wing of the Republican Party or more of the America First, Donald Trump, Ken Paxton wing of the party. We now have the ability to offer that choice to the voters.
How do you define America First?
So, to me, I actually kind of always look for scriptural reference to kind of support, because I always thought that this was more than just a political ideology. I thought it was kind of a moral imperative. And so when I came across 1 Timothy 5:8, where St. Paul is telling the fledgling leader in the church that he who does not take care of his relatives, especially his immediate family, is not only betrayed the faith, but is worse than the unbeliever. And what that means to me is that right now, in fact, even if we go outside our offices, even though we're in a nice area, there are people on the street. There are people battling addiction, battling mental illness. We have veterans that we're not taking care of. We have public schools that are failing our children. We have a border that's being overrun, and unfortunately working class people are having to compete against illegal aliens for wages. And so to me, it means prioritizing the people that are in your immediate family, your fellow citizens.
What do your endorsements say about your campaign? And as you know, among the people who have endorsed you is Attorney General Ken Paxton, Texas Agricultural Commissioner Sid Miller, also Lieutenant General Michael Flynn and Roger Stone.
So I guess what it says is that those are people who all speak for the kind of the America First wing of the Republican Party. Some of the endorsements that I'm most proud of are the number of Tarrant County and Parker County precinct chairs, because I've actually been a precinct chair for the last 3 years and have been in the trenches kind of. The Republican Party is a grassroots, ground up kind of party. And so those people have gotten to know me because I've been in the trenches fighting, block walking, door knocking, and electioneering for people. And so they've gotten to know me probably best of all outside of Ken. Ken Paxton and I have known each other for over 20 years. And so he was my first endorsement and one that meant a great deal to me.
What are your top 3 priorities if you're to be elected?
Well, the first one is securing our border. A country without a border is not a country at all, and especially when you have this wave of misery that accompanies it. It's an issue of not only immigration, but national security. We've basically ceded control of not just the border, but the interior as well to the cartels, and that includes the fentanyl trafficking and the deaths. That includes the human trafficking, which unfortunately has become a very prominent problem even in the Dallas-Fort Worth area if you speak to law enforcement. And then, like I said, you have a wave of people who are not U.S. citizens that are competing with working class people for jobs and artificially suppressing their wages. So that's priority number 1. Number 2 is we need to get a handle on this spending in government. In fact, I'd break this up into 2 parts. We need to unleash our energy industry first. I think that we have kind of moved into this green new energy deal where we're not only raising our own energy costs. The government's subsidizing it, but we're also now dependent on solar panels, wind turbines, lithium processing and batteries that all come from primarily China, which clearly is a country that is not viewing us in a favorable light at this point. So why we put our energy dependence on a non-reliable intermittent source that has to be subsidized by the government and puts inflationary pressure on our country. And then the second part of that is the government spending. I mean, it's this wanton spending. We can't seem to get back to pre-COVID spending, even though COVID is behind us, so to speak, as far as like a crisis that we don't understand or have our hands around. And yet, we're still spending in the $6.5, $7 trillion a year, running up deficits at a time when interest rates are going up, putting further pressure on our budget as a government. So those are kind of the immediate term solutions or priorities. But the other thing that I would say that's really of importance to me is getting back to our constitutional roots. In fact, I think we were talking earlier and I mentioned that one of the attacks that had been levied against me was that I was supposedly had confessed that I'm no longer a conservative. Well, the point that I was making is when they can take away our God-given rights, the whole basic founding premises of our country and our Constitution, and then they actually are, the government, both state and federal, can be the greatest threat to our rights, then we don't have anything left to conserve. We have to restore, and we have to go back to our founding principles.
I wanted to go back and ask you a little bit about border security. As you know, there was a bill that was developed on a bipartisan basis in the Senate, and then it was rejected. It didn't go anywhere. But
right.
If you were in Congress, and if it were to have gotten to the House, how would you have voted on that?
I would have voted no, because candidly speaking, it was just kind of codifying what was existing right now, putting a cap on illegal entrance. We don't say we're willing to tolerate a certain amount of crime. And again, people who enter our country illegally, because there are ports of entry and there are legal methods too. I myself have immigrated to another country. Everybody secures their borders. So why we should just open it up and say, well, we're going to tolerate this much illegal activity. Counter to that, there actually was HB 2 that had been passed by the House before, and actually I thought that was a fairly significant border security bill. In fact, the only problem I had with it is it didn't include E-Verify. But other than that, the Senate already had a bill passed by the House that I think would have strengthened the border situation.
And so what is your solution?
Well, the first thing of it is kind of the narrative. So there has not been any repealing of any laws or any stripping of presidential power. What we see right now is clearly an administration that is not following the existing laws or statutes. And not just that, for example, our Attorney General has taken this administration to court in order to re-implement the Remain in Mexico policy. And even though they will get a favorable court ruling, this government has just continued to disregard it. So when you have Department of Homeland Security working with Customs and Border Patrol not to secure our borders, but to develop an app so we can process people coming up through the Darien Gap and through South and Central America faster into the country, I think we just see what happens when all of a sudden this government is no longer a government run by law.
Ukraine funding. Should Congress pass a bill?
The real tragedy about that whole situation to begin with is there's a professor out of the University of Chicago, Professor Dr. Mersheimer, and he said that NATO and the EU were going to lead the people of Ukraine down this path of destruction. So I say that because, for example, when George W. Bush at the Bucharest Climate discussed that Georgia and Ukraine would join NATO, Putin responded by invading Georgia. When then we had the Maidan revolt and a duly elected president of Ukraine was overthrown, albeit a pro-Russian one, and was reinstated with one who was more pro-Western leaning, then Putin invaded Crimea. So this idea that this war was inevitable, no, it was in direct response to us talking once again about Ukraine joining NATO and joining the EU. So my first thought on that is that this war was preventable, and then even in the early days there was a peace negotiation from Erdogan that was on the table that would have been something that would have put a cessation to these hostilities. The second thing I would say is that I hear oftentimes people talk about this in the form of national defense, that we're degrading Russia. Well, actually, Russia's military capacity and their economy are actually flourishing right now. So mission failed there. And it's an utter disregard for the lives that have been cost on both sides of this conflict. So no, I'm a hard no on aid to Ukraine. I know that we're being told that this is a way to protect democracy, and yet actually I think there is no democracy currently in Ukraine. They've suspended elections, they've outlawed the Russian Orthodox Church, they've nationalized all the media. So I don't see any reason for us to be involved. And in fact, if anything, if we were to be good global citizens, we would be suing to try and bring both parties to the peace table.
So what do you say to those who say, the Russia, by saying no to funding for Ukraine, you're just allowing Putin to win, and that would send a message to him: keep going, go to other countries, and maybe some of them would be NATO countries, and then you'd have U.S. troops in there. What do you say to that?
So the first thing I would say is, again, they have not been listening to Vladimir Putin. And I'm not saying that he's a good guy. Two things can be true at the same time. But he's drawn very clear red lines in the sand, and we have routinely just crossed over those. Ukraine is a very special place in the Russian people's psyche. We lost hundreds of thousands of people in World War II. They lost tens of millions, and that place is known as the Bloodlands for a reason. The western half of Ukraine fought with Nazi Germany, and the eastern half of Ukraine fought with the Soviet Union. So you have a bit of a people divided. I don't think it's a logical step to say that once Putin eliminates what he viewed as a strategic threat by having NATO on his doorstep, that he would just continue to roll in. The other thing I would say is it belies reality, because right now Ukraine doesn't have a funding problem. They have a population problem. They have a manpower problem. They've been ground down, which is the Russian people's way of fighting war and has been throughout history. So the average age of the Ukrainian soldier in the field right now is 42 years old. And I know they did this mobilization call up of 500,000 people. Well, they don't have 500,000 young men left to go fight. In fact, there are more Ukrainian men from 18 to 34 living abroad right now than there are in Ukraine, because those mothers and fathers don't want to see their sons thrown into the charnel house.
Israel and Hamas war, what do you say? What's your response to those who are calling for an immediate ceasefire?
That one's a pretty tough situation, and I know it's going to sound like I'm now turning around and spinning my argument on its head, but I don't know how the people of Israel can rest safely as long as Hamas continues to remain a threat to their national security. Hamas is an arm of the Muslim Brotherhood, which have been expelled from almost every country in the Middle East, and their stated purpose is to destroy the state of Israel. If you were to ask Hamas right now, would you accept a two-state solution? Not only have they rejected it in the past, they're not interested in their own state, they're interested in ending the Israeli state. And in fact, if you go look at the minutes of their previous meetings, they actually have a design for a Palestinian state, and it includes the entire territory of Israel. So it's a difficult situation, and I know Israel looks bad right now because they're trying to do everything they can to limit civilian casualties, and yet Hamas is purposely fighting in populated areas to try and draw the body count up to increase outrage and win the war on a narrative basis, which to me I find atrocious. But Israel has proven with the IDF that they try and limit civilian casualties to the greatest extent they can. They just recently unintentionally and unfortunately killed some aid workers, and they owned up to it, and they've made the necessary steps to rectify it. So it's a situation that is just a tinder keg ready to go off, and unfortunately you have other outside combatants who are weighing in and trying to further provoke Israel into other military action. So I don't know that it's the United States' responsibility to tell Israel what they should or shouldn't do to protect their own national sovereignty.
Abortion rights is part of this whole national debate,
right,
in the general election. So I'm wondering, where are you as it relates to a proposed national ban on abortion, or if you believe that the states should be the ones to make this decision?
So, I heard President Trump's position here just recently about that, and I do agree that Dobbs got it right in overturning Roe because there was not a need for the Supreme Court to weigh in to establish that. But by the same token, look, I'm Catholic, so I'm obviously pro-life. And I understand, though, that as a representative, you have to represent the will of the people. And so as much as I would love for this country just to turn away from abortion in general, that's not current sentiment. I do think that while a ban on abortion is not realistic, or like I said, where the country is at right now, I do think that pro-life isn't viewed as radical. It is this abortion up to and upon delivery, or even a botched abortion, to be able to terminate the life of the child. So there is some common ground where I think the vast majority of Americans concede that, we're not okay with partial birth abortions, or we're not okay with third trimester abortions. And so I think if the federal government were to look at some kind of way to codify something that the vast majority of Americans are okay with some limited restrictions, then me, being pro-life, would see that as a win and the ability to save some children's lives that otherwise would be lost.
You mentioned before the different views in the Texas House.
Right.
Some call it a civil war in
Yep.
the Texas Republican Party. But even in the U.S. House, among Republicans, you're seeing a lot of division
Yes.
right now. And so I'm wondering, if you were to be elected, how would that impact your decision on filing of bills and working with, Republican leadership?
So, I think Texas actually is a microcosm of what's going on at a national scale in the Republican Party. And I think it's pretty clear that you have a very conservative wing of the Republicans in Congress versus kind of the more establishment type who, have traditionally been more go along to get along types. Where I see myself personally weighing in on and trying to reflect what I have heard from the people of the 12th Congressional District is that, they want that more conservative voice out there. They want somebody who's willing to listen to them and to represent them the way that they want to. We've polled the area. The area is overwhelmingly more America First versus kind of the establishment part of the party. So I would see myself joining a group such as like the Freedom Caucus. In fact, that's actually a group that I hope to have a formal invitation from and would join once elected. And then as we continue to build upon that and grow that branch of the Republican Party, then they will start to move further up in the leadership positions and kind of help shift the narrative and drive the agenda moving forward.
Last question. What are you going to do to get your supporters out to the polls on the primary runoff? It's always a challenge for candidates to motivate their folks to get to the polls.
Sure, and I get it. I mean, there's a little bit of voter fatigue going on, especially with all the crises that people are hearing and facing and dealing with in their day-to-day lives. But what I think we're seeing now is that the grassroots and the voting base are actually finally kind of getting a sense that their voices are being heard. We've seen a lot of incumbents primaried here in the state of Texas, and several of them have been outright defeated, and a number of them have been pushed into runoffs. I think that there are also 5 other congressional primary runoffs in the state of Texas. And so, the message to my voters are that the job's not quite done, but I've been so humbled by the response from the grassroots and from the base voters who have been volunteering and block walking and texting and calling and electioneering on my behalf. I don't think that that's going to be too much of a problem for the people who are supporting me.
John O'Shea, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much.